Okay, so today we are talking about memory, and memory is defined as the capacity to retain, so that's your ability to store information, and then also to be able to access or retrieve that information when you need to use it again later on, and the structures that account for this particular capacity. So memory then is manufactured in the sense that our memories are not completely accurate. Your memory is not like a video device. It's not like when you take out your phone and you record a video and then you play it back and watch it. Memory doesn't work that way. Memory is a reconstructive process where you are bringing in your own personal biases, the way that you saw something, the way that you remember something. So you're adding your subjective bias so that the way that you remember something is not always objectively perhaps the way that the event actually occurred. So one example of our inability to use memory like it is a video recording is this concept of what's called source misattribution. And with source misattribution, sometimes we are unable to distinguish what we actually experienced from what we've heard or were later told about an event. So some of you might have stories that have been told so many times in your family. Maybe it's a story about something that happened before you were even born, but you feel like you were there. You feel like you remember it because you've been told about it so many times. Or another example of source misattribution could be that, you're talking to a friend and you say, oh, you know what, I heard this really interesting study on the news today, when really you read about it in the newspaper. We have particular conditions that occur with memory, so memories for particular events that are called flashbulb memories. And the flashbulb memory, the name comes from the old-time camera that had the giant flashbulb on top of it, and it illuminated the event. And so flashbulb memories then are your memory for some kind of unusual, shocking, or tragic event that holds a special place. You believe that you can remember exactly where you were, what you were doing, who you were with when a particular event occurred in very, very explicit photographic detail. So, for example, I remember where I was when I learned about the 9/11 Twin Towers. That, for me, is a flashbulb memory. The problem is that even flashbulb memories have errors, so they are subject to the same conditions that our regular memories are subject to. Confabulation is another problem that can occur with remembering. So with confabulation, we spontaneously produce false memories. So these can be memories for events which never occurred. So you might, make up, like for example, when I was little, I used to tell people that I had visited Disney World when in fact I never had. So that's a memory for an event that never actually occurred. Or memories of actual events which are displaced in space or time. So let's say that, you have a memory that you visited San Francisco, but in reality you were confusing that memory with the time that you visited a similar place like San Diego. Or in this example here, a patient describes in vivid detail a visit from her parents the previous day, and you later discover that her parents have been dead for years. So we see confabulation a lot with individuals who have dementia or Alzheimer's disease, where a lot of times, they'll have these memories that are displaced in terms of time. So they might be able to remember really, really vividly things that happened maybe 50 or 60 years ago, but they have a really hard time remembering what they had for breakfast this morning. Okay, so I want you to watch the video on eyewitness testimony before continuing with this, and then we'll talk about eyewitness trials. So eyewitnesses are relied upon in courts of law to provide some kind of corroboration, some kind of evidence. in convicting a person. However, eyewitnesses are not always reliable, so their memory is subject to the same kinds of errors that everyone else's memories are subject to. And there are a number of factors that influence the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So in the video, you heard the law professor mention that I don't remember a thing about him except for odd shape of nose. And then later on, when the psychologist is interviewing the law students, the blonde student says, oh, I don't remember a whole lot about him. He had a weird nose, though. So that is an example of how misleading information can be introduced, and it can actually influence the memory that you have. And then later, when the blonde-haired student is asked, you know, where he would have gotten that information from, he has no recollection for it. He doesn't know that his professor is the one who introduced that misleading information. So in looking then at what makes a good eyewitness, what are the kinds of things that you should look for if you're ever a witness to a crime? You should look for things that the perpetrator, so that's the person committing the crime, can't change. So you would want to take note of things like unusual facial hair, perhaps a scar, if they have tattoos, a limp, if they have some kind of accent, and those kinds of things are much more difficult for a person to change, and those are helpful to police in identifying perpetrators. Okay, so let's talk about two different kinds of memory. So we have explicit memory, and then we'll talk about implicit memory as well. So when something is explicit, it is out there, it is very obvious, it is intentional, it is in your face. So explicit memory then is a conscious, intentional recollection of information, okay? So you are really, really trying to recall information when you are using explicit memory. Two different types of explicit memory. There is recall and recognition. Recall. This tests your ability to retrieve and reproduce from memory information that you've already learned. So for example, essay exams and fill-in-the-blank exams that don't have a word bank. It doesn't count if they have a word bank. So essay exams and fill-in-the-blank exams test recall, right? They give you a prompt, and then it's up to you to go into your memory and retrieve that information so that you can use it to complete the assignment. With recognition, though, you only have to identify information that you've already learned. So the correct answer is there, right? The information that you need is already there. It's just up to you to figure out which piece of information is correct, which piece matches the information that you've already learned. And so multiple choice exams are really great examples of forms of testing that require recognition. So out of the two of these then, recall is definitely the more difficult of the two, right? Because it doesn't give you the information, right? It's up to you to be able to retrieve that information. Whereas with recognition, all you have to do is pick it out. It's already there for you. The hard work is already done. With implicit memory, though, if something is implicit, it's implied, right? It's not as obvious. It's not as out there, blatant, in your face. With implicit memory, then, you're not actively trying to remember information. However, you have unconsciously retained some kind of information. So something that you have been exposed to, some kind of experience, information, manifests itself. It shows some kind of effect on your current behavior or your thinking. And we measure implicit memory using indirect methods. One way to measure implicit memory is by using the indirect method of priming. So with priming, a person is exposed to information and is later tested to see if exposure to that piece of information affects their performance on another type of task. So in the example here, this person is exposed to auditory information. So they hear the word defend. So they're being exposed to information, defend. So that's the influence. And then later on, we'll say, okay, I want you now to come up with as many words as you can that start with DEF. If the person produces defend as one of their answers to that question, we could say that that is a way that we're measuring this implicit memory. You were already exposed to this word defend, whether you consciously tried to, retain that information or not, it has influenced how you perform on a different task later on. So that's priming. Let's talk also about relearning. So with relearning, we look at the amount of time that's required to relearn material, and we compare that with the time that it took you to learn the material the first time around. And if you relearn the information more quickly the second time around, you must be remembering something from your first experience. So the theory of relearning goes. So you probably experience this when you guys are preparing for exams. If you do distributed study time, so that means that you study the material over several days. You kind of spread it out, which, by the way, is a highly recommended practice for doing well in your courses. Don't try to cram it all into one day. Spread it out over 3 to 4 days. So you probably noticed that the first day you spend a lot of time relearning the material, right? But then the second day you come back to it and maybe you spend a little bit less time. And the third day a little bit less time. And by the fourth day you are ready. You know this information. So that would mean that relearning has taken place because you're spending less and less and less time on it with each encounter, with each experience with that information.